Deflation, by the way, in my opinion, is the worst of all economic maladies. Nothing is worse than deflation because it's hard to stop and it gets into this really scary cycle where nobody wants to spend because everything they have will be worth more later. And so they don't want to spend it. And then you have like this double hit and it's treacherous. You can't handle it. Inflation is much more tolerable, but deflation.
So creditism, our new economic system, must have credit growth to survive.
Yeah.
If credit contracts, we spiral into...
So can we just get more... Some will be listening to this saying, well, can we just get a little more reasonable? Can credit just maintain and not grow? And can we get more fiscally sound? I mean, look, if you talk to any of the sort of the old-fashioned thinkers about this, like Jim Rogers comes to mind. You know, he lives in Singapore, right? So he's not far from us. And he's been on my show a few times. And, you know, he just talks about what debt, it's such a problem. And I don't know if that's really true anymore.
So our lives are floating on top of the biggest credit bubble in history.
Yeah.
All of global civilization is floating on top of a bubble. If it pops, everything around us is going to, go up in flames, essentially.
Yes.
We're going to crash into a depression that would probably be worse than the Great Depression.
So can we come off of this? Are we just like drug addicts that have to get our fix of credit? Or can we just sort of get it to a maintenance level without crashing things to where credit doesn't grow, but it doesn't contract? It just sort of maintains a balance, a homeostasis.
I think that we just have to understand the way our economic system works now and use our addiction to our advantage. We need to invest this credit, create more credit and invest it,
right?
So that the economy just grows a lot faster.
Yeah.
And if the economy grows a lot faster, then the debt to GDP goes down and the government debt to GDP goes down.
Not because the debt goes down, it's because the GDP goes up.
Right. And we have to grow our way out of this.
Yeah.
If you start doing the reverse and have austerity by cutting spending very radically, then suddenly, so the budget deficit, let's just call it $2 trillion a year. The government spending is roughly $7 trillion a year. If you tried to balance that, if you cut $2 trillion out of the government spending, suddenly there would be $2 trillion less going to individuals and businesses.
Right.
So those businesses and individuals would have much less money to spend and they'd begin defaulting on their debts. It wouldn't take long before the banking system got into crisis. The banks would start to fail again. And so rather than making the government's budget balance, revenues collapse along with the economy. And as government revenues collapse, the budget deficit would get bigger rather than smaller as a result of extreme austerity. Austerity just leads to a worsening level of debt to GDP because the GDP shrinks, government revenues shrink, and unemployment goes up. Things start to fall apart, then the banks fail. And when the banks fail, what are you going to do? You're going to have to bail them out again with massive government budget deficits, or else accept the fact that civilization is going to collapse.
Or the Fed can just be the only bank. That's certainly been talked about, right? That's a thing. But look, I don't think you have to really argue for your plan because I think that's the plan we're following anyway. I mean, maybe the government isn't investing and they don't have a sovereign wealth fund yet. Hopefully this will all change. But the government is definitely into creditism. They're definitely into deficits. I don't think that's going to stop anytime soon. Do you?
Well, when they're forced to by a crisis, then suddenly they respond. And whether they understand what they're doing or not, they keep the bubble inflated.
Yeah.
Because the alternative is collapse again. And they recognize that. I mean, this has been a long time coming. 10 years ago, I would say the government should invest in new industries and technologies, and people would say, well, that's an interesting idea, but the government's never going to do that. And then a couple of years ago, they finally got around to passing the Chips and Science Act.
Right.
$280 billion government investment in new industries and technologies, including $50 billion that we desperately need to invest in building semiconductor factories in the United States. So we're not dependent on Taiwan. So that happened. And then we got the Inflation Reduction Act, which also had a lot of government investment in new industries and technologies. And then on September 5th, President Trump, who was running for office then, came out in support of a U.S. sovereign wealth fund. And the next day, the Biden administration said, we've been working on that for months. So suddenly, we're getting to the point where the government recognizes that it needs to invest in new industries and technologies. We're trying to pull the rest of society along behind them and explain why that's suddenly necessary. So hopefully that's where we go. Now, coming full circle back to, again, we don't know for certain what President Trump will do. There could be some good things like a sovereign wealth fund, and there could also be a lot of bad things, and then things could happen that I just don't foresee. Who knows what's going to happen with any precision? You can't tell the future. But I would say that, look, if we put on high tariffs, then that's going to be very inflationary. Because suddenly, if you put 60% tariffs on Chinese goods, the importers, the American corporations doing the importing, like Walmart and Apple, they pay the tariffs. And then they pass it on to the American taxpayer as higher prices. That's the first round effect. First year shock in inflation, much higher inflation. But there's a second round effect also, because American companies would bring their factories back to the United States and hire a lot of American workers,
which is the idea, right?
Which is the idea Trump wants. But we already have full employment. The unemployment rate is 4.2%, which is pretty much the lowest.
So then we probably can't deport people. You need to bring them in. Or we have to have automation.
Even before you start deporting 11 million people, which is at 7% of the workforce, you already have this shortage of labor that leads to a wage push inflation spiral like we had in the early 70s. And then you deport 11 million workers, and it's the whole thing inflammatory in terms of wages and prices and inflation.
Right, but the one wild card in there is automation, right? So, I mean, there's more and more of that, and it's been going on for a long time, but, I kind of think of that hockey stick graph, right? I think we're at a new phase of that with OpenAI and all the rest.
Well, soon, I suppose within 10 years, we could have autonomous robots who could do a lot of the manufacturing work in the United States, but not now. I mean, not immediately.
But it's not just the manufacturing stuff, it's the middle management stuff. The white collar jobs. I mean, I'll give you an example. My phone's being used right now, but I have an AI chatbot on my website now, and it's the 4th iteration, and it is incredible. I mean, literally, if I die tomorrow, it can take my job. I mean, my whole job is like explaining things to people. That's what I do. It's called Delphi, and it is incredible. It talks to you when we go to dinner. I'll demonstrate it to you. It's mind-boggling. And all of these things are happening just in so many ways. They say that this next new year will be the year of autonomous AI agents.
Yes.
That basically just everybody has an AI assistant in their pocket. This just goes through every class. There's no limit. I was in Mexico City recently, and I saw blue-collar people using AI, on their phone, like using ChatGPT. Man, I couldn't believe it. I thought, isn't that for college-educated people? No, everybody has it. This is so democratizing. It's amazing. You don't have to be smart anymore. Your device is smart.
I embarrassed myself the other day trying to show off to my Thai barber.
Yeah.
I pulled out ChatGPT and was going to show off what it could do. It's like, oh yeah, that's ChatGPT. We use that.
Yeah, right. Yeah. He already's using it. Yeah, your barber.
My barber.
In Thailand.
In Thailand.
Yeah. It's not just the manufacturing thing, right? We've got the robots. I mean, Peter Diamandis, says that everybody's going to have a $20,000 robot. It'll be $300 a month. You'll pay for your humanoid robot that'll do all sorts of stuff for you. But it's a lot of the knowledge work, creating songs, creating art, creating documents, of course.
Suppose there will be disinflationary. The very first shock that's going to hit and hit hard is when we get 60% tariffs on China and 20% tariffs on the rest of the world, and suddenly we got inflation in February.
I can't imagine he's going to do that abruptly. I mean, that would just be crazy.
Right.
I mean, I wouldn't support it.
Yeah.
I'd say, listen, if you want to do a tariff, do 10%, and then next quarter add 10%. Do it slowly. You've got to have an adjustment time.
My approach would be to put tariffs on Chinese goods to slow down their economy and deter their threat to U.S. national security.
Well, but that's what he is doing. What do you mean?
Let's say more tariffs on Chinese goods, not on our friendlier countries, so we can still access low-cost goods that will continue to put downward pressure on U.S. inflation and U.S. interest rates. That would be your better approach. But it does seem that there is going to be some tariffs imposed relatively soon in 2025.
Okay.
And at least 500,000 workers are going to be shown the door.
Yeah, right. Okay, so that's inflationary, both of those things. I mean, getting rid of cheap labor is inflationary. Obviously, tariffs are very inflationary. How much inflation does this mean?
significantly more. The Fed hasn't quite managed to get the inflation back down to its 2% target.
Right.
It was on track to doing that, but this would knock it well above its 2% inflation target.
It means higher interest rates.
Which means the Fed would start hiking interest rates again, rather than cutting interest rates, as they're expected to do, as they have been expected to do. And if the Fed starts hiking interest rates, this is going to make the dollar stronger. The dollar's already moved up, but President Trump wants the dollar to be weak.
Right.
He wants to have high tariffs. He wants to deport workers. He wants to cut taxes and stimulate the economy that way, which would be inflationary, but it would make the economy grow faster. And at the same time, he wants a weak dollar. You really can't have all of those.
Right. Those are interrelated. And
Right.
Yeah.
Unless President Trump can find a way to take over monetary policy.
Right. Okay. So here's Trump ending Fed. He doesn't have to fire he can't fire Powell. Okay. And Powell said he would not step down. I loved his answer. No. Right. But if you just outright somehow end the Fed completely, which, I mean, how would he do that?
A few weeks ago, I made a Macrowatch video called "Will Trump End the Fed?"
Yeah.
Okay, let's jump to this. A few steps. If he could bend the Fed to his will and just make them do what he wants, which he can't, not immediately, because in theory he's not supposed to be able to fire any of them. Right. Jerome Powell's term doesn't expire until I think May next year, May 2026, and the others are all staggered over a number of years. So he called
all the other the open market committee members right here. So it's not just about Powell. Of course, he's just the chairman.
That's right. There's 7 Fed governors, 12 presidents of the Federal Reserve ranks.
Yeah.
To take turns voting on interest rates. So that would be difficult to bend them to his will. Although, who knows what Trump might do.
Yeah.
He won the presidency. He's got control of both houses of Congress, and he has a 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court.
Yeah. No, he's got a 2-year run. He's just going to pass everything he wants.
The only thing he doesn't have control over is monetary policy. And he may decide he wants that too. So if he can't bend the Fed to his will, ideally he would, even if there is inflation, he would still like to have the Fed cut interest rates so that the dollar would fall, or maybe do quantitative easing. The more QE you do, the more dollars there are, that would tend to put downward pressure on the dollar as well as long as you're not worried about taming inflation.
Yep.
So what else could he do if he can't bend the Fed to his will? Let's look back to what happened in the 19th century. The Fed didn't come into existence until 1913. It started operations in 1914. In the 19th century, the Treasury Department issued the currency, Treasury currency.
Right, but we have 2 other central banks in the country. I don't know much about them.
Yeah, the first one, I think, ended in 1834 or something like that, followed by a depression, by the way.
So 30 years before the Civil War. Yeah.
Right. And after that, there wasn't much. There was nothing. So during all of that time, private sector banks issued bank currency, and there was money circulating as gold and silver formed part of the currency.
Mm-hmm.
But when the Civil War started, the Treasury Department issued treasury notes. And by the time the Civil War ended, 43% of all the currency had been issued was paper money that the Treasury Department had issued. Wow. And there was another big round of Treasury currency being issued as United States notes in the early 1890s. So President Trump will have direct control over the Treasury Department. So he could instruct the Treasury Department to begin issuing Treasury currency again. To compete with the Fed. But the Fed wants to do quantitative tightening and destroy money. You could just have the Treasury create twice as much money as the Fed destroys and effectively take control of monetary policy away from the Fed.
It's that easy trick.
Well, so this would probably require some sort of congressional act to make this
Well, in the first 2 years, he might get it. I don't know. That's pretty extreme.
Possibly. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, and just one pesky senator could pull a filibuster and stop any necessary legislation from passing. Right. But there's a workaround. I think in the mid-1990s, a law was passed and still in effect that gives the U.S. Treasury Secretary the authorization to print any platinum coin of any denomination of his choosing.
Only platinum coins.
This is the law.
Not dollar bills. No, I mean, most money is electronic, of course, so
no one really foresaw the implications of this. The idea was to allow decorative coins to be created.
Okay, sure. Yeah, for collectibles. Yeah.
But the literal interpretation of this is the Treasury Secretary does have, under the current law, has the authorization to print or create platinum coins of any denomination of his choosing. So he could print a coin, $1 coins, $1 billion coin.
Price of platinum could go through the roof. Well, not if it's $1 billion coin. That's right. Yeah, it could be a $1 trillion coin.
That's like people talk about the $1 trillion.
Can you imagine the collectible value?
People talk about the $1 trillion coin. It doesn't have to be $1 trillion coin. It could be, the $1,000 billion coin. It's like, take this coin. He actually has the authority to do this now. Deposit it at the Fed or Treasury General account, or essentially at any other bank, and you've created and start spending this money any way you choose. And effectively, in that way, take control over monetary policy away from the Fed. It seems to me this is a way that President Trump could take control over monetary policy. Okay, so sideline the Fed.
So if Trump is able to do that, which actually seems pretty easy the way you describe it, what does that mean to the economy? What does it mean to us? And when we talk about inflation, it's obviously very uneven. There's asset inflation, consumer price inflation. Those are very different things. And I want to circle back to that because you alluded to it earlier. But if Trump does this, what does this mean?
Well, first, it means that he could make the Fed completely irrelevant.
Yeah.
So the Fed might want interest rates to be higher,
right?
But he could print enough money so that there'd be so much liquidity that the price of money would fall.
Well, wouldn't all that money he created cause inflation because there's more dollars chasing limited goods and services?
It would. Negative consequence, of course, would be more inflation.
Right.
Especially if you have high trade tariffs.
And there's no one taming inflation now.
Right.
We got high tariffs. We've exported cheap workers. They're gone. They're kicked out.
Right.
And then we've got lower rates.
Right.
And more money supply. This is a recipe for Zimbabwe, isn't it? I mean,
the best approach there would be, as I mentioned earlier, you could put higher tariffs on Chinese goods coming into the U.S., but don't put higher tariffs on the goods from other entries. In that way, we could continue to pull in low-cost goods from the rest of the world.
Yeah, but you're going to make a real enemy out of China.
China is already a real enemy. There's no going back there. China intends to take over, it intends to be the dominant global power, and if we don't stop them, they will. So we've crossed that line.
Okay.
There's no going back.
Okay.
And so ideally, with control of monetary policy, if it had low interest rates without very high inflation, just as long as he doesn't put tariffs across the board on all countries, just on China, we could still have globalization. The importance of globalization can't be overemphasized because in 2008, globalization was in full swing. The Fed created enormous amounts of paper money then, and we had no inflation because of globalization. It was so deflationary.
Yep.
But the difference in 2020, Fed created a lot of money. But this time, global supply chain bottlenecks were all disrupted because of COVID. Asia had COVID, and they were shut down here. The factories weren't open.
I think that was a wake-up call to us that we've got to manufacture more in the U.S.
And just about the time we started getting over COVID, Russia invaded Ukraine.
Yeah.
And that pushed up oil prices and wheat prices and minerals and metal prices. So the Americans were locked in at home. They couldn't go out and spend money on services. So they bought a lot of things through Amazon, like iPads and iPhones and jogging machines, which are all made in Asia.
Right.
But Asia couldn't produce because the factories were shut down. So this was a blow to globalization, and that pushed up prices. The demand was higher, but the supply was not there. So we got inflation, whereas we didn't after 2008. And then as soon as COVID started going away, Russia invaded Ukraine, and that created the second blow to globalization. And that caused oil prices to go up and food prices to go up and metal prices to go up. And that created another round of inflation. Actually, if you look, inflation went up all the way to 9% in mid-2022, and now it's down to about 2.5% again. The Fed increased interest rates to try to slow the economy and reduce demand to bring inflation down that way. But the Fed didn't succeed in bringing down demand. The Fed increases interest rates to slow the economy down, basically in order to get a lot of American workers fired. Once they're fired, they can't consume.
It's the Phillips curve.
So demand dropped, and then prices dropped. Right? But that's not what happened. A lot of American workers didn't get fired. We had full employment, 4.2% unemployment. So the Fed didn't succeed. They didn't push up interest rates and bring down inflation. That's not what brought down inflation. The thing that brought down inflation was the global supply chain bottlenecks got worked out.
Fair enough. But, Powell held on to that supply chain argument, I think, for way too long. He should have raised sooner and more slowly. It was too shocking the way he did it, and it was too late. The supply chain thing was true, but it stopped being true 6 months later than Powell last said it. He was saying it, and it was just like he wasn't paying attention.
Right. Well, they didn't expect the high inflation, of course, and they should have increased interest rates sooner than they did. They said it was a transitory, but instead of being transitory over 1 year, it was transitory over 2.5 years.
Right.
But ultimately, it was transitory because it's gone now.
Sure.
Because the supply chain bottlenecks got worked out.
But how much of this is China? So if you put the huge tariffs on China only, and you let all the other BRICS countries do what they want, now Trump has attacked the BRICS and said, you trade outside of the dollar and we're going to tariff you. So China is just a giant part of it. So if you make the Chinese goods so expensive.
Well, of course, things are complicated.
Yeah.
President Trump first imposed tariffs on China in 2018.
Yep.
And soon after that, China's trade surplus with the U.S. peaked at roughly $420 billion that year. Last year, it was down to just $270 billion. And so there's been a big drop in China's trade surplus with the U.S. already.
Okay.
But part of the explanation for that is China's just taking Chinese goods, shipping it into Mexico, changing labeling, and then sending it on to America.
Yeah, it's very hard to tell with these super complex supply chains because, there's this little part, there's that little part. When you call it made in China or made in Mexico,
And the same thing is happening through Mexico.
Sure. Yeah.
It's going to be complicated. You're going to have to find out which goods are really Chinese goods and tax them and very quick tariff. And over time, you can tighten the screws on China. China's economy is in very bad shape now for numerous reasons. And China effectively just makes far more goods than the whole world wants to buy, right? The world is not big enough to absorb everything that China's making. So China's whole growth model is going into crisis.
Well, and, Peter Schiff's whole argument, and he's been so wrong on it, back in, 2003, 2004 was saying, the decoupling is going to happen, right? China's going to create its own consumer middle class, and they're just going to sell their products to their own people. Well, that didn't happen at all. I mean, the only reason it kind of happened was Trump #1, that trade war. That was it.
Yeah, it looks like China's turning Japanese in that Japan's bubble popped in 1990. And before then, everyone thought Japan was going to take over the world. But their bubble popped in 1990. And the only reason they didn't have a Great Depression was because the Japanese government borrowed more and more money every year. They took Japanese government debt to GDP from
230% or
from 60% in 1990 to 260%.
Oh, wow.
And that's what China's going to do. But they'll probably have to do that, and still they won't grow, just like Japan's economy hasn't grown for 30 years.
And China has a very bad demographic problem, just like Japan has.
Terrible.
Yeah. I've been seeing it for a long time. I don't think China's that much of a threat, honestly, to the U.S. But you've got to get past this next 5 or 6 years. The worst part is now, right? But if you get past 5 or 6 years, I think that's going to really subside the demographics.
China's population is already shrinking.
Yeah.
It peaked a few years ago at 1.4 billion people. By the middle of this century, it's supposed to be down by 100 to 200 million people.
Wow.
And by the end of the century, down by 400 to 600 million people.
But that hardly tells the story, what you're saying. You're just talking overall aggregate numbers. Right. What really tells the story of what's happening to China and what happened to Japan is the age of those people within that demographic pyramid. And it gets really lopsided really quickly, where you just don't have enough younger workers to support that heavy top older population. That's a country really without safety nets anyway. So,
right. But China has so much momentum behind it.
Yeah. I think they're very smart in the way that they're really placing a lot of emphasis on automation. And I kind of think the way they're thinking about that is this is how we solve our labor problem. We just automate our way out of it as much as possible. And they're doing that. I mean, they're very good at robotics and getting better.
They're very good at most high-tech
manufacturing in general.
Because the government is investing so much in new industries and technology.
Yeah, which is where we should do. And it was the start of our talk.
Now that they have a property crisis, they're not funneling money into developing new property. They've got so much infrastructure, the government's funnel a lot of new money into building infrastructure. So now they're funneling all this money into developing new industries and new technologies. So the next 10 years to 10 to 20 years, it's completely crucial. If they keep doing this, they're going to come through with such extraordinary breakthroughs. Americans feel so safe and secure. We've been top dog for so long. They should better wake up before we get hit with some sort of Chinese Pearl Harbor, right? It won't look like Pearl Harbor. It might be something along the lines, the science fiction's lines of being hit by billions of nanobot poisonous drones.
Oh, yeah. Who knows? Yeah.
It could be something completely out of the blue, right? That results from their investments in new technology, right? Because they are doing this on a massive scale and we're not. So you may be right, and I hope you are right, that they are not a threat, but we better assume that they are.
Well, I think they are a very big threat now, and I think that threat, again, lasts for about 6 years. It would last longer, obviously. It's just a matter of degree on the way. But you know what China seems like they could do successfully? Because they've got all these ghost cities and all this massive amount of infrastructure, and they're not able to create their own baby boom. And plus, that takes too long. It takes 26 years, right, to get those workers to be productive, right? If they're not agrarian, then it only takes 12 years, maybe. But if they want them to be high-tech workers, it takes probably 26 years, right? What they could do is become an attractive place for immigration. They could fill up their country with immigrants, both the way we have. They could import deflationary pressure with those immigrants. If they were knowledge workers, all the better, right? But there's not a place people want to move to. But if they were able to change that, that could be a really good business plan for China.
China would not be a bad place to live. Shanghai is quite nice.
Well, I agree with you, but it's I don't know. Are people around Asia, are smart people in neighboring countries wanting to move to China to make it big there and seek their fortune and their future?
Or they prefer to go to the U.S.
Yeah, right.
But China's not very welcoming to start with.
That's what I'm saying, though. If they could change that, that would be a really smart business plan for them because they've got the capacity. Look, let's wrap it up with what to expect from Trump. And it sounds like you're saying it's incredible they take control of fiscal policy. Obviously, monetary policy. They're obviously control of fiscal policy already. But inflationary, sounds like you're saying inflationary. Do you see double-digit inflation in there, or?
Depends on, how soon, how fast, how many get deported.
Yeah, and then separate between consumer inflation and asset price inflation, if you would.
There's something that's very timely and interesting and important that is going to happen next week.
Okay.
In June 2023, Congress agreed to a truce and they suspended the debt ceiling, the government's debt ceiling. And they had battle after battle over lifting the debt ceiling, letting the government shut down. So they just said, okay, we'll suspend it. No debt ceiling until January 1st, 2025. And then it comes back into effect, right? At whatever level of debt that the government has at that moment.
Okay, so it will be $37 trillion.
So that means the government won't be able to borrow starting next week. It won't be able to borrow any more money.
Okay.
And that means that this is a problem because the government's budget deficit was done last year. It was $1.8 trillion. And it's likely to be very high again, especially if President Trump cuts taxes as he promised to do on wages and tips and Social Security payments and by the votes and everything else. That will make the budget deficit much larger, in fact. And we don't know how much cost cutting we'll see from Doge and Elon Musk, but it looks like the budget deficit will be larger. You can't spend that money if you can't borrow that money. And you can't borrow that money if there's a debt ceiling, right? And last week, President Trump asked Congress to pass a spending bill that would allow the government to keep spending until March, which is separate from the debt ceiling, right? And as part of that bill, he asked Congress to raise the debt ceiling for at least the next 2 or 3 years.
Okay.
And 38 House Republicans voted against that bill. And they voted against raising the debt ceiling. So you have this hardcore faction of Republicans in Congress, and the Republicans only have a razor-thin margin, but 3 to 5 people in the House. And 38 of them had come out in defiance of President Trump last week, not voting for this bill to lift the debt ceiling. They seem intent on not having any more government spending unless you can have some government debt reduction. This raises the possibility of a real economic crisis arising in the not too distant future. As I mentioned earlier on in the conversation, last year, half of the increase in the debt of the country was due to the government's increase in debt. Okay? And since 2008, half of all the debt that has increased has been the increase in government debt. So if suddenly government debt stops increasing, right, then total debt stops increasing. In other words, credit growth slows down very sharply. It looks like a recession. That tips the economy into a severe recession, perhaps in short order. So that's something to keep an eye on in the immediate future, is this battle over the debt ceiling. If the debt ceiling doesn't rise substantially, and if government debt doesn't keep growing at a very strong clip, then the economy is likely to tip into recession. Yeah. And that's very likely to cause asset prices to come tumbling down. And asset prices, by the way, are extremely inflated relative to their historic norm. Right. The thing I look at, I call it the wealth to income ratio. Household sector net worth divided by disposable personal income. Wealth to income. Okay. The long-term average of this, going back to 1950, is 550%.
Wealth to income ratio?
Yeah, wealth to income, 550%.
Okay.
Is now 780%.
Wow.
The two previous peaks, one in 2000 at the time of the NASDAQ bubble, that was 620. And when that popped, then the property bubble in 2007, it peaked at 680%. And that bubble popped and went back to its long-term average. Now it's 780%. So it's telling us that asset prices are very stretched relative to income, right, and vulnerable to any kind of shock. So if this were to pop and go back to its long-term average, that would destroy tens of trillions of dollars of wealth.
That's interesting, So what you're saying is that the incomes can't be more than a certain percentage of the overall wealth. In other words, the wealth kind of gets out over its skis. The income can't support it.
That's right.
But a lot of that wealth this time around is financed on incredibly low interest rates, especially 30-year mortgages. Does that change it? I mean, I don't know how much overall wealth you're considering, but the real estate market is like 40-something trillion in increased equity or something like that. I can't remember. Okay, forgive me.
No,
but
very large part.
Yeah, and that's financed at those super cheap lock-in mortgage rates, so people don't have to flee from that wealth or exit it, right? So, and they're not going to sell it, so it's not going to cause a tumble. Now, if the stock market may be a completely different affair, and business values. So cool.
Well, so this wealth to income ratio has been quite high now for a couple of years already, right? And they used to justify it by saying, well, interest rates are near zero, the federal funds rate.
Yeah.
And so it makes sense that asset prices are high. But even after the Fed increased the federal funds rate to almost 5.5%, the ratio still remained very high.
That changes everything for all the short-term debt holders. If they finance the wealth with that debt,
yes,
it changed, and then it completely changes everything. But it doesn't change it for the real estate people, right?
Until, eventually people want to move, or, they have to move.
Yep.
And so even with...
They have to move, but they don't have to sell.
Some mortgages are 15 years, some mortgages are 30 years. A lot of this debt is much shorter than that, right? And we've already had several years if this time go by. So over time, even...
Yeah, they've got, 26, 27 years left on their mortgages, if they're 30-year mortgages.
So, I mean, that does help justify this high ratio. But as you said, then there's the stock market.
Yeah, and that's not my area, so I don't know.
Over the last year, the increase in stock prices accounted for 80% of the increase in the total wealth.
But when you started talking about this, I thought you were going to cite PE ratios. That's instantly where I thought you would go, but you didn't. Yeah.
Well, PE ratios are also very high.
I know. Yeah.
So with this wealth to income ratio so high, and the possibility that we may see interest rates begin moving higher, along with higher inflation, then it's suggesting it's really quite vulnerable to any sort of shock or anything that goes wrong. Should, like, a government shutdown or the refusal to increase the debt ceiling or high tariffs or the invasion of Canada
or who knows what, or take over the Panama Canal. Yeah. Now, I know it kind of would amaze me if these people would really defy Trump. I mean, he said something that was kind of interesting, and I do believe him this time. I don't always believe him. But he said, the first time around, it seems like he was fighting everybody and everybody was his enemy. And this time, everybody wants to be his friend.
Right.
And I believe that. I feel that same vibe. So it sort of surprises me that you would have these 38 politicians.
The Republicans.
Yeah, well, that really surprises me because the Republican Party had mixed feelings about Trump before, but this time around.
And this is, there's a hardcore group of them that really believes we have to cut the government spending and cut the budget deficits.
That's kind of old-fashioned thinking, honestly. I think we can kick this can down the road a lot longer. Maybe it's to 100 trillion. I don't know. Nobody knows the number. We've never been here before.
U.S. government debt to GDP is 120%. Japanese government debt to GDP is 260.
Yeah.
Where we are now, they were there 25 years ago.
And they don't have the reserve currency.
And they don't have hyperinflation or any other.
And they don't allow immigration. They're a closed society. They have a whole different set of problems.
So that shows that we can keep kicking the can down the road. And meanwhile, as we do, we can invest and turbocharge our economy through investment and actually get vertical takeoff and grow our way out of this crisis. Whereas the alternative of austerity just will bring us into a downward spiral. So policy is going to be very important over the next year. It's going to be very interesting to follow. So that's what I do in my video newsletter.
Yeah.
Macrowatch.
Excellent, by the way. Yeah. I love Macrowatch. I've been a subscriber to Macrowatch for a very long time.
Thank you very much.
And folks, let me tell you, Richard does a phenomenal job. First of all, the free component of his email newsletter, then you get to click through and you see whole slide presentations. So you've got the visual and you've got him talking about it. And I'd really recommend, I think you have a discount for people. So by the way, I'm not making any money off this. Hey, he's not a sponsor or anything. So
I started Macrowatch 11 years ago. It's a video newsletter. Every couple of weeks, I make a new video. The last one I did yesterday, it's 20 minutes long. It has 50 charts that you can download.
Oh, they're excellent.
And it's describing something important happening in the global economy and how that's likely to impact asset prices and economic growth, with a lot of focus on credit and also money creation and government policy. Now government policy is going to affect credit growth and money creation and what that's going to do to asset prices. There are now more than 100 hours of videos in the Macrowatch archive. If your viewers are interested, they can find Macrowatch on my website, which is richardduncaneconomics.com. And if you'd like to subscribe, hit the subscribe button. They'll be prompted to put in a discount coupon code. Right? If they put in with discount code Bangkok, where they can subscribe at a 50% discount.
That's a fantastic offer.
And it's very affordable. I'm sure your viewers would find it very affordable. As we discussed earlier on in the conversation, our economy just doesn't work the way it used to work when gold was backed and money was backed by gold. Our economic system now is driven by completely different forces and has a different dynamic that you're going to learn in your classical economic textbooks.
I agree.
And what I try to teach in Macrowatch is the way that the economy really works now in the 21st century. So that's what Macrowatch is all about. I hope your viewers will go to richardduncaneconomics.com and at the very least sign up for my free blog there.
Yeah, I'd really recommend it. And, your point is so well taken, Richard, that so many people are playing by old rules and they don't realize the game has changed. For example, on one of my strategies that I've been teaching for 21 years, inflation-induced debt destruction, so many people are playing by their parents' or grandparents' playbook, which was true in their day before we went off the gold standard, right? When that tether was finally severed in 1971 on August 15th by Richard Nixon, everything changed. The whole game changed. And you've illustrated that in our talk today in many ways in terms of trade and international relations and geopolitics and so forth. But on a personal level, it changed and people are playing by old rules and they are just missing out. So that's one of the great things Macrowatch has taught me, and I'd highly recommend it to people. Richard Duncan, thank you again for being on the show, and it's always good to have you, especially in person.
Jason, yeah, thank you for having me. It's great to see you.
All right, my pleasure.